Thank you for joining today's program. My name is Francine Newsome Pfeiffer. I'm the Vice President for Federal Relations here at Rutgers, and I have the pleasure of teaching here at Eagleton. Joining us in the drawing room this evening are the undergraduate associates. They're seniors here at Rutgers. I am delighted to be leading our discussion this evening for the Eagleton Institute Albert W. Lewitt Endowed Lecture Series. The Albert W. Lewitt Endowed Lecture was established by Mrs. Benjamin Leon in memory of her brother who worked on Capitol Hill in the 1940s, first on the staff of Senator Warren Barber and later for Senator Albert Hawks. The annual program is presented by a current or former member of Congress, congressional staffer, or an expert on Congress. I'd like to take a moment to thank the Lewitt family and the supporters of the Institute for this public program series and for making conversations like today's possible. Throughout today's program, we definitely encourage our Zoom participants to ask questions via the Q&A function. Unfortunately, one of our guests, Ivan Schlager, had a problem with his flight and is unable to join us today. We are very happy, though, to welcome a former Congressional Staff Director, Mr. John Raidt, as our guest this evening. And to introduce Mr. Raidt, I'd like to turn to one of my students, Matthew Brodsky.
Good evening. My name is Matthew. I'm a member of the Eagleton Undergrad Associate Program and serve as president of Rutgers Camden Student Governing Association. I'm very honored to introduce John Raidt today. John is a senior advisor with Jones Group International and consultant to Special Competitive Studies Project. He has over 35 years of public policy experience, including on national and homeland security, telecommunications, trade, commerce, energy, and the environment. He has served as a professional staff member of 3 national commissions, including the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, better known as the 9/11 Commission, the Commission on the National Guard and Reserves, and the Independent Commission on the Security Forces of Iraq. In 2008, he served as Deputy to General James L. Jones, United States Marine Corps, Special Envoy for the Middle East Regional Security. He is a former senior staff member to the U.S. Senate, having served as legislative director for U.S. Senator John McCain and staff director of the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. John is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and an author of 2 books, including Politics, Inc., America's Troubled Democracy, and How to Fix It, and numerous publications on national affairs. He holds a master's degree, a public administration degree from the Harvard Kennedy School.
Thank you, Matthew. And welcome, John. So we want to get right into it. And I want to just preface this by saying our students in this class just had a lively conversation about free speech and hate speech on college campuses. So maybe we can touch a bit on that because I know civic literacy is important to you and as something that you cover in your book. But before we get started, could you perhaps describe briefly how you found your way to Washington? Why Capitol Hill and then on from there?
Well, I sure can. Well, thanks, Francine, and thanks to John Farmer, to the Institute, for Jessica, and for all the students. I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving and a great weekend, and thanks for joining this evening. And I'm sorry about Ivan. He had a little glitch, but it's too bad he was my counterpart on the Commerce Committee, and we worked quite well together. I thought that would have been good, but maybe we'll have the opportunity to do it again. Well, I from Arizona, went to Arizona State University, and I was actually a journalism major. And I had a mentor who said, if you really want to be a good journalist, you have to understand government. And he suggested that I find a local congressman to work for. And so that made a lot of sense. Figured I'd do that for a year or two, and was looking at the bios and came across John McCain's bio, which to me was quite something. My father served in the military, and looking at John's background, I thought this was somebody it would really be interesting to work for. And being a journalism major, I knew how to write some and spoke Spanish and checked a few boxes. I really had no connection to him or his operation. And the fact that he had been in Arizona for such a short period of time, there wasn't a large network. So I was hired. And then, of course, my intention to stay a year or two, 30 years later, I'm still in Washington. So that's how that worked out.
I know that feeling. I do. I'm 27 years in myself. So one of the things, I really want to dive into your book, but I guess first we should talk a little bit about work on Capitol Hill. I think if for people who are maybe casual observers, they don't fully understand the role of staff on Capitol Hill. Could you talk a little bit about the role that staff play? And I'd love for you to reflect a bit on both committee staff and on personal office staff and what that looks like.
Sure. And I think it's important to really talk about the two sides of a congressional operation, both the state, which handles a lot of the state affairs and politics of that type of thing, and then the Washington office, which handles the legislative. I started out in the state and I did casework. And that's a really significant part of every member's job is voters, citizens, people who voted for your member or not, call and say, hey, I have a problem with the federal government. And I have to say, I really found it to be a rewarding start when you're there every day facing real life problems. Some of them quite heartbreaking, but really rewarding when you're able to help folks. They're not always legitimate cases. About 50% of the time, they're absolutely right in the problem that they're looking to correct. And so again, that was very rewarding. I worked there for a couple of years and then came to the legislative side and worked in both the personal office and the committee staff. So the personal office really handles the broad portfolio of a senator. And you have some of the main positions are your chief of staff, and you have legislative assistants, which are assigned a particular issue area that they follow very closely, should have some expertise or at least gain the expertise in that area. And then legislative correspondence. You get an enormous amount of communications when you're a member of Congress, and people expect rightfully to get sensible replies, timely replies to their correspondence. So that's a big part of every operation. And then, of course, you have your press office, which is a growing part of almost every member's. There's probably more press secretaries and press assistants than there are people working on the issues these days, which really is an issue we could talk about later on.
Let's definitely do that. I'm curious if you can talk about the role that staff play in legislation, in actual negotiations and deliberations. We've seen a lot of dysfunction in recent years in Congress. What's happening behind the scenes? What are the staff doing during those periods, and perhaps to try to prevent that kind of dysfunction?
Right. Well, I'm a little bit dated in my time, but I spent quite a bit of time there. And staff are critical because they're following the day-to-day. They really are diving into the issue. They have the time. That's their job. And to be able to inform the member of Congress, the senator, what's going on, particularly following committee activities, making sure they're well read on the issues and the publications of the day, what's going on with their constituency, what's the flavor of mail on particular issues. And I have to say, a lot of it does depend on the member you work for. I happen to only work for one member, John McCain, and he was very entrepreneurial and very supportive and say, hey, if you have a good idea, I don't care whose idea it is. If I think it's good for the country, go out and conquer. I'm there to help you, support you, work with you. And that was really a rewarding part and why I stayed working for him so long. We really did a lot of fun things together. Other members might not be that flexible with their staff and have a more of a controlling method of work and operation. But yeah, a lot of times it's staff to staff negotiations, preparing things. Really, if you're doing it right, the members come in and sit down for the last few really tough issues to make their cut. And I worked there during a period, like I said, Ivan, my colleague who was supposed to be here today, was the Democratic Staff Director of the Commerce Committee when I was McCain's director on the Republican side. And we got along really, really well. And we tried to make sure that we assessed each measure, each amendment, if you're working it on the floor, in committee, or just talking about it on its merits rather than who offered it. I have a story that I recount in my book is I remember we were on the floor with a bill, I can't even remember what it was, and one of our junior staff came up and said, well, there's an amendment can be offered, so we'll have to oppose it. And so, well, why do we have to oppose it? He goes, well, it's been offered by a Democrat. And I'm like, well, is it good policy? Well, yeah, it would be a good thing to do. Well, then we'll support it. And sadly, there is that element of Capitol Hill that everything is seen within the competition rather than what you're doing. Is it good, bad, or not?
Yeah. And that leads me to my next question, which, and I'm going to be a little cheeky. Do you have friends that are Democrats?
A lot of them, yeah.
So people don't believe me when I say that Republicans and Democrats can be friends. And in fact, that's part of the glue that when things are working, really having a relationship with someone, even when you, and especially when you don't agree with them, is so critical. Can you reflect on a time that working across the aisle, you were able to get something done and relied on trusted friendships?
Gosh, that lots of things that we did across the aisle. In fact, in any state, you have to work on both sides of the aisle to get things done. We did a lot of public lands. We put 3.5 million acres of Arizona land into wilderness protection. That was done between Republicans and Democrats. So you really have to, and I have to say that's the one of the biggest changes I've seen in Congress over the years is the hollowing out of the center. There are very, very fewer and fewer members come from the center part of the spectrum. And there's a lot of reasons we can talk about that's the case. And you used to have the gang of so-and-so that were a few Republicans, a few Democrats, and they were going to drive both caucuses to get a solution to something we needed to do for the good of the country. And that you just don't see that the way you used to. And members that have been around talk about the time when they would socialize, they got to know one another, their spouses, their friends, their families, and they had a basis of trust on which to do things. And that's really changed. People fly in, they go home on the weekends, they fly in on Monday, do their business, get out on Thursday night. And it's really changed the culture of Washington in a very negative way, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I've sadly seen that too. And I think that's a nice segue to talk a bit about your book, Politics, Inc. So first I want to talk about the name of the book. Why Politics, Inc.? How did you arrive at that?
Well, I think the problem that I see is that in many ways, politics has become a business. The overweening role of money in politics, the fact that it has a marketing element to it, as the two sides have separated into the fringes. And so that has really troubled me because we have now 364 or 5 days a year of campaigning. It didn't used to operate that way. There was campaigning period and then there was legislating period. Now it's all one big agglomeration with a focus on the campaigning. So that was, I named it because I wanted to reemphasize that this main theme of politics operating more like a business than public service in many ways.
And then speaking of campaigns, I know you have some thoughts in your book about how you would change things to make things function a little more smoothly. Do you want to elaborate on that? I think that would be good fodder for some Q&A with our students.
Well, sure. I think you see some trends. The bad things are trending up and the good things are trending down. I'll give you some answers. Some of it from polling is trust in government has slowly gone down over the years, and it's rock bottom. 75% of people in the last poll I saw don't trust government. In 1960, 3/4 did. Trust in the media is completely down. Bipartisan bills in Congress, and even physical intermingling on the floor. I think there was a university in Iowa looked at C-SPAN footage over a period of time and showed that over that time, there were less and less, fewer and fewer members crossing the aisle physically, which I thought was a really interesting metric. The number of swing districts have gone down. So I was talking about the hollowing out of the center. Because of gerrymandering, more and more districts are really heavily one side or the other. And this has really changed the calculus of how you get elected. Way back when, and not that far, 20 years ago, the calculus was the race for who can grab the center. Now it's more about inflaming and firing up your base and getting your base out, saying what it takes to get your base out, and suppressing the other side's vote. And that's really, to me, a very damaging way. And when you add in technology, and as I say, the role of money with super PACs and how that's exploded, and so much of it is spent now on negative advertising, that's another one of those negative trends that have been up. And, I want to recount those. Animosity of the other party bordering on hate. That's not something that has an old tradition. That's something very, very new. The emphasis on negative ads. Back in John Kennedy, when he ran in 1960, 10% of the ads were negative. In the last few elections, that's 70, 80, and I'm sure that's going to continue to grow. The cost of campaigns is just absolutely skyrocketed. The length of campaigns has grown. And one element that I think has been very damaging is the growth of out-of-district and out-of-state contributions. one of the factors driving the role of money is the Supreme Court basically equating speech and money. And my retort to that would be, if that were really true, then I doubt the founders would have thought it's a good idea that most of a member's campaign dollars, in many cases, come from people who they don't speak for, who live outside of their district or out of the state. And one of the reforms I really feel strongly about is if you really did restrict donations to those who you can vote for and live in your state and represent you, I think that would cure a lot of ills. A couple of those steadily increasing trends is landslide victories. And then, of course, all of that, as you look at campaigns and getting elected, that then translates into how Congress operates. As they say, it's 24/7 campaigning all year long, and that really hurts a system that's intended to legislate and oversee, not campaign.
So what do we do about the nonstop campaigning? Are there solutions other than the campaign finance reform that you mentioned? Other thoughts on timing of elections?
It's easy to say, let's do this. Having it pass constitutional muster is very difficult. The other thing, we are a republic, and you've got 50 different systems, and so many elements and aspects of election law are really governed by the state. And I've long thought that probably the quickest path to important reforms is probably not through Congress itself. It's probably through governors who get together, and you've seen this in some cases. There was a Democratic governor in North Carolina who joined with Republican Democrat in Maryland, who really sought to change the way districts so it was fairer, less gerrymandered, more equally balanced, and bring some public interest and common sense at that effort, rather than whoever is in charge of the state legislature figures out what's the best thing for our party to stay in power.
Yeah. So in Congress, that group to me feels a bit like it might be the Problem Solvers Caucus, the folks in the few in the middle. Any thoughts on them and whether or not they are having much success?
I find it incredibly ironic that there was something like 60. It's probably more than 60 members under the Problem Solvers Caucus. I thought Congress was supposed to be a 535 member Problem Solvers Caucus, but I guess we'll take what we can get.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn soon to students for questions.
Sure.
But before we do that, so you talked a little bit about, so super PACs bad is what I'm getting from what you're saying, as well as those out-of-state contributions. What does that mean for districts where there just isn't much money? What does that mean? I'm trying to think of what the downside might be in those more in poorer districts. Will they just have less information about their election? How do we? Yeah, and then thoughts on the media.
So. I mean, I think the goal of campaigns and elections ought to be battle of ideas, not just money. And I think if everyone's operating from the same pool, that will tell you a story as to who can raise what. You could also, if it was just too restrictive, you could also put a cap on the limits that only 10% or 15% of your money should come from out-of-state folks. And again, I'm sure there would be strong constitutional challenges, whether that, particularly since the court equates money and speech, it would be very difficult. But we have to start talking about these things if it's going to penetrate the decision makers in Congress, but also our judges and jurists.
That's a really good point. How about the role of the media? Can you reflect a bit on what you see? To me, I mean, I'm concerned about the loss of local media and strong local journalism. I think the election of George Santos would be something we can look to as evidence of that. But feel free, tell me what you're thinking.
Yeah, I completely agree. A little bit about Santos is obviously what a horrific story. But also, I think about the failure of the media. All the media outlets, how they didn't catch this early on. What are they doing? And then even opposition research. Every campaign has opposition research. Why wasn't this discovered? It's really astonishing to me how someone could get away with that volume of lies and get elected and not be caught until after the fact. It's just too much. But the media, it's interesting, and I'm going to put this both in classic media and social media, is in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we had three networks. and most people turned into those networks for their news. And so there was a common frame of reference. You could argue whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. Even in older days, you had the stump. They call it the stump speech because someone would get up on a stump of a tree, and in the town square, everybody turned, and one voice, people listening. That's not the case anymore. When you look and first I'll talk about regular media and then social media. When you look at the outlets of not just network, but cable television, satellite television, and the radio, and the internet, the number of outlets is just gigantic and getting bigger every day. They're businesses. They have to make money. So what do? They cater particular ideological niches. We see this obviously classic Fox case and CNN case and MSNBC. They know who their audience is, and they know people like to hear things that they agree with and they can take comfort in, and that's who they cater to. So it's a business strategy. Again, I fold that into the whole politics Inc. Same thing with social media. People get their news from so many different sources. And again, it has that same niching, and people talk about confirmation bias that is very unhealthy. Now, obviously, you have to take the aggregate. People have access to a lot more information. That's a good thing. They can contribute their voice. That's a good thing. But unfortunately, all technologies have a dark side, and we really are feeling the effects of that dark side, I think, in our political culture.
Ooh, yeah. So I'm going to try and brighten this up a little bit with optimism. So I ask my students at the beginning of the semester if they had a magic wand, what's the one thing that they would change? What would they use their magic wand on? I'm curious, given the host of issues facing the health of our democracy and our society, what would you use your magic wand for?
Yeah. So I'll tell you the outcome, not how you get there, but we have to restore the political center in this country. It's I call it the construction zone of functional democracy. And unless we do that, and in the days I was up there, the centrists and those who try to reach across the aisle were called statesmen, and they were highly regarded people, and they were principled people. It's not like, well, whatever it is, let's compromise because compromise will get you there. That's not the way they operated. And now they're turncoats. And I'll tell you an interesting development that I've seen. And some people we're not divided; we're splintered. When you look at both caucuses, there's members in the Democratic caucus that are raising super PAC money to defeat centrists in their own caucus. Same thing in the Republicans, and that's incredibly unhealthy, particularly if you're only going to have two parties. I talk a lot about the party duopoly and their interest in perpetuating that duopoly. And you have that type of activity, you need a big tent party if you're going to have a two-party system. You need two big tent parties.
So you touched on third parties. Thoughts on that as we look ahead to the next presidential election? Yeah,
it's interesting. I'm sure many of your students are well-versed in this, and you hear, well, third parties, all they do is throw the election, and that third party would throw it one way or the other. I don't buy that. I think there's some historical precedent saying that there's some truth to that, but I don't buy that with the proper reforms. First of all, most people, and I'd bank most of your students probably don't feel terribly comfortable in one party or the other. We're a country where you can get 5 million types of wines and beers and coffees, but two parties in a very, very complex political culture and with technology, and the issues are very difficult. No one probably feels terribly comfortable in one party or the other. So I think we need to break the duopoly and say, well, how do you stop this of throwing it one or the other? First of all, I think it's a very bad trend in our country that so many elections are won by plurality. And how do you get to a true majority? Well, there's a ranked choice voting, which we won't go into the details. I'm sure some of your students have studied it. I think that's a really good thing to do. There's fusion voting. So I know what I like. I like to belong to a party that I think reflects most of my views, and they should be able to nominate the same person that another party does. But in most states, that's not allowed. And again, that's because Republicans and Democrats together, they have certain interests that serve both parties. That's usually what the election law looks like in their state.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. So with that, I'm going to turn to my students. Just a reminder for my students to introduce themselves when the mic comes to you. And I think, Matthew, you're sitting closest to the mic.
Hi, it's me again, John. My name is Matthew. First off, I appreciate the shout out to ranked choice voting. I'm personally a fan of it as well. But I want to go back to the media question because I think we talked about it briefly. But I just want to hear, how can we get more involvement from local or state media that feels sometimes really lacking, or that city or township based print journalism? How can we try and revive that? Because I think in this age of corporate 24/7 media, that feels sometimes almost impossible.
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, because it is a business, and a lot of now are nugging down just to their sports and weather, because people prefer to get their news on the national scene, and it really is sad. In the media chapter of the book, talk about some things that I think we need to do. This might sound a little banal, but I don't know where else you start. Is really doing a better of teaching voters and everyone about how they consume media, and be more thoughtful in it. I use the analogy that people roll their eyes, but in the 70s we had this horrible littering problem, and that's just the way people are, that'll never change. Well, we had a concerted campaign to teach people that littering is very bad, and it's a problem that's much better. So I think it starts with education of how you consume information, and taking things with a grain of salt, realizing that there's someone on the other end that is going to make money from your eyeballs or your click, and that is a key motivator of theirs. But in terms of one other thing that I think should go for the national media is we have the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. We should have that same type of stamp for journalistic outlets. There was, as a journalism major, the first thing I saw that my father gave me, he went to the University of Missouri Journalism School, was the journalistic rule of ethics. And this is what you were supposed to look. None of them bear any resemblance to how the media really operate most. And for the book, I talked to a lot of journalists, and it wasn't like they disagreed. Oh, you're being unfair. They agreed with a lot of these observations. So I think taking that list of ethics and applying that in a Good Housekeeping seal approval, identifying who are the journalists that abide and operate by these ethics and principles, and same thing with their outlets, would be something that we could and should do.
So if I could ask a follow-up to that, John, what would that look like? Is there an organization, would it be a third-party group that would be empowered with that Good Housekeeping seal, or do you see that as a role for the government?
No, I don't think the government should have a role in that, because we got to really be careful of censorship. I think it needs to be an independent third party, just like Good Housekeeping is. There's no government element to that, and it can be done. There's enough altruists with money who would put money behind that, because look, and garbage in, garbage out. If people are reading misinformation, disinformation, that's forming their opinions and then how they vote, that's a very dangerous chain for democracy. And it really troubles me today. I take a quick diversion of this. In the book, I talk about the fact that the division and dysfunction that is stamping our political culture and system right now, it's a national security issue. You look at foreign leaders, particularly in areas that are growing and be very influential in the lives of your students, and mainly Africa and Asia. There was an Africa president named Paul Kagame in Rwanda who was pretty Western oriented, and he was interviewed a couple of years ago at a conference in Africa, and he said, we no longer look to the West for a model. Why would we? Look how it's operating. Why would we want to imitate that? That's really dangerous. So all this feeds into that, I think.
Thank you. Kieran has the next question. He's on the, do we have someone closer to the? Bear with us, John. The mic is traveling across the room.
No problem.
All right. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Hi, my name is Kieran. I'm a senior at Rutgers studying political science and economics, and I'm also an Eagleton undergrad associate. And thank you so much for speaking. So I know that you mentioned a hollowing out of the political center, but do you also worry about a hollowing out of experienced members of Congress, especially as many are no longer seeking re-election? One name that comes to mind is Joe Manchin, especially those people that have, built the foundations and built a lot of those connections from their years in Congress. And what do you see as the solution to that kind of hollowing out if there is that problem?
Yeah. So thank you for that, Gwen, and thank you for studying economics, because the economic literacy and tech literacy in Congress among staff and members needs to go way up. So thank you for making that your course of study. There's so many members. There's an organization in DC now, and it's escaping my attention, made up of former members who left because of the frustration. And we are losing good people. And there are a lot of great, and don't let my inherent negativity give the wrong, but look, there are a lot of really great people that work there, and there's a lot of good things that happen there. The problem is that a system that is a little bit out of whack, I can't remember who said it, but a bad system will beat good people every time. And I'll tell you, a systemic issue that's really driving a lot of people out, I've talked to a few members of Congress about this, is the death of what they call regular order. If you want to lead and you want to represent your constituents, you go back to Washington, you want to be part of the process. And my time in the Senate, that's how it operated. People would go down and offer their amendments, and they were part of the process, and they felt part of the process, and they were more likely to sit down and try to find middle ground and consensus that served what they were trying to accomplish. And a lot of times they'd find it. And now the way it operates is most of that is done many times, particularly with the most controversial bills, with just a couple members, probably in the majority leader's office, and then it plopped on their desks, and they use the rules to basically say, okay, you got it, yes or no. And I had one member of the Senate said, when you're marginalized in that process because you haven't been around for a long time, and you can't offer amendments, and you can't represent your constituents and your voters in your state, there's nothing left but partisanship. So getting back to regular order will help this march out of Congress, restoring some of the guardrails. Again, there was a decorum back when I was there. Look, it was very partisan. It's meant to be partisan. It's meant to be contentious, but it's got to be fair and functional and dignified if it's going to persist. And when you look at senators standing up who want to fight a witness, or you hear the word liar on the floor, these are things that did not happen. And these guardrails are disappearing. And we're going to have to get some of that back, or we're going to lose the good people that are there. And we're definitely not going to attract the good people who say, why would I want to go be part of that?
John, if you don't mind, could you talk just a little bit more about what regular order actually looks like? I want to remind you that my students are in their early 20s. I don't think they've been alive to see regular order happen. And I'd also love it if you would talk a little bit about the preponderance of continuing resolutions and what that does across the federal government.
Sure. And this is a little bit of part of the dysfunction. So regular order would be a member of Congress would introduce a bill. That bill would be referred to committee that has jurisdiction on that subject matter. There'd be hearings on that subject matter. It would come up for what they would call a markup, and that was the committee chair and the ranking member would call their members together. You have a quorum, and they would start deliberating on the measure. People would offer amendments to hopefully improve it. Some would be accepted, some would be rejected, and then there'd be a final vote on that measure. The committee would write a report that would describe what it is it's trying to achieve and why the provisions are what they are, what they rejected, what they accepted. There'd be minority views out of fairness. Somebody say, well, I voted against final passage because I think despite the good intentions, here's going to be the real impact of this. So I vote, and then it would be referred to the Senate calendar, the full Senate. And then that's when the rules of the Senate kick in. We could spend 3 weeks talking about that, but it'd be on the calendar and available, be called up for action by the full Senate. And if the full Senate is acting at its best, members of the larger body then can come down, and this, I'm talking just on the Senate. House has separate rules, and be able to offer their amendments until all were satisfied. Or if somebody decided that they were going to filibuster and just talk and try to avoid a vote, there's a procedure for stop that. You'll hear a lot that you have to have 60 votes in the Senate for anything you really want to accomplish. That's because the filibuster can only be cut off by 60 votes. So you have this supermajority. And by the way, that's another one of those things that are increasing, is the number of filibusters and the number of times you have to file cloture. And again, contributing to this habit now of the leadership just having to craft bills in their own office, bringing it down, filing cloture immediately, and taking everybody else off their feet from the opportunity to offer amendments. So that's regular order. And that has gone by the wayside. It's made Congress less effective. And it's interesting and a good thing for your students to debate. One of the things that was done years ago with my boss in the lead was stopping earmarks of spending, because there was so much bad spending that was being done, bridges to nowhere, programs that really didn't serve anybody. But I'm a member of Congress. I represent a state, and there's an interest in my state that wants it. So I'm going to go in, and earmarks are done. The good side of earmarks is that it got people in the game. They had a vested interest in a particular bill because they had a little piece of it. Earmarks were done away with. And there are those who will say that that contributed a lot to the gridlock and the disinterest in working across the aisle. And of course, earmarks are coming back. But sadly, that's for a topic again for another day, or maybe somebody wants to do a more complete study on this in the class. But I'm sure some of the abuses will return with the return of earmarks.
Yeah, as a lobbyist, I have a conflicted view of earmarks myself, and I appreciate you raising that, John. I was going to ask you about them. Other questions from the room before Ethan? And turning to the online audience for questions.
Hi. My name is Ethan. I'm studying political science and public policy with a minor in economics. I really appreciate your discussion of what it seems like are small d democratic reforms like campaign finance, ranked choice voting, restoring the middle, things like that to kind of bring down the temperature. And I really appreciate that, especially in this moment. That's something that's very important to me. And I'm very curious, as someone who was formerly a close confidant and advisor to someone who once led the Republican Party. How do you think that Republicans today and the party itself can shake off this far-right authoritarian leadership that it currently has and actually work towards those democratic reforms that you suggest?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think everyone sees reforms, and I'd say this at the state level too, it sees reforms through the lens of their party. Will a particular reform help or hurt us? And rather than what will make for a stronger democracy, what's a fairer system, that type of thing. And so that's a pretty hard dynamic to break. I think people have to see a path to be able to get elected by doing that. So then it was said, for good, bad, or ugly, at the end of the day, a true democracy, they get the leadership they deserve. And so it doesn't all rest with the majority leader and the leaders of the parties themselves. It really is going to require, and that's why I'm so thrilled to talk to you all today, because you're going to be the reformers. And that's really good news to me. And I have a lot of hope, despite my dark assessment of where we are. I really do have a lot of faith, because I think there are a lot of really great young people who are on the ball and they can bring these reforms. But at the end of the day, they're politicians, they're counting votes. And we're the ones that tell them where their votes are going to lay. So that will be the salvation.
Great question, Ethan. I think Virginia has the next question.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't think you can see me. I'm over here.
I
Hi. So my name is Virginia Uehara, and I'm a sociology and public health student here at Rutgers. My question is about more your perspective on campaign strategies and campaign etiquette, I guess. I was wondering what your take is on the, I guess, attention that we pay to, I am on a camera, the attention that we pay to candidates' families, and really in the sense that like we've seen so much more presence with, say, like political dynasties, especially on like maybe the local and county and state level, but also, you know, federal. I mean, going back to, you know, John Adams all the way through the Bushes, just in the past, in the most recent decade. So I was wondering, since I feel like a lot of campaigns in which I've been involved, there's been an emphasis on like, well, if their spouse said it or if their children said something, you know, well, we shouldn't pay attention to that because they're not the one running for office. When the reality is, at least in Southern Southern New Jersey, we've seen that they actually are likely to be running for that seat, maybe in the next election, maybe, you know, especially with the inclusion of on the federal level, like widow succession and things like that, to the extent that all of those people who are related and, you know, who are applicable in this case should be part of the decision.
Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, I don't think dynastic politics, whether it's Bush's, Clinton's, Adams, is particularly healthy, but name ID really matters. And like any business, and I say that in a good way, not a bad way, in the sense you learn the trade. That certainly was the case with the Bush family. I'm sure other families, the Adams and others, are that way. But all's fair in love, war, and politics. And there's just no getting around that if a family member, a close associate, or child does something good, bad, or indifferent, it's part of the campaign. It's part of the equation. It's not always fair, but it really is a reality. That's why, coming back to it, I'm so astonished about this whole Santos thing, because they're looking at what grade your kid gets, but they miss this gigantic issue. Again, somebody's going to have to write a book about it because it's inexplicable to me. But I think that I talked about guardrails. Guardrails are gone down everywhere, not just in Congress, but in the media, what's fair and what's not fair. And again, the business element to this, what's going to attract attention, what's going to attract eyeballs, what's going to help you in your ratings at the end of the year. And if being unfair, if focusing on something that's not terribly important, but it's fun or interesting or salacious, that's where the attention's going to go. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but I think it's a reality. And it's probably a fair reality for the most part.
Thank you. I'm going to check now to see we have a question from the audience.
We do.
No, it's from online audience.
Online audience. Yes, we have a few questions that came in. The first one is from Prudence, and she asks, what will be the impact of artificial intelligence on politics and government?
Wow. What a great question. I think that remains to be seen. As I say, technology always has its ups and its downs. In the book, I talk about the fact that you see some instances where members of Congress, campaigners, are using algorithms of how to sound more sincere. And as we have the nichification of politics, where I know a particular, this really is, I'm not a political consultant or a campaign guru, but I know it gets down to they know what households in particular districts could end up swinging an election. They also know what they like, what they care about, what they want to hear. And so I think artificial intelligence is going to probably reinforce some of the most damaging aspects of pandering to niches and doing it in a very customized way. One of the things I think we ought to be doing is any communication that goes out as a formal communication of a campaign, whether it's for fundraising or otherwise, ought to be posted on the website. So you can't say different things to the different audiences because you're pandering to them. An area where I think artificial intelligence will help is we see the role of deep fakes, the damage this is doing, because now anything that's legitimate can be dismissed as a deep fake. And no one's really going to know if something's legitimate because of the presence of deep fakes. And I think AI and some of these technological tools, we're going to really have to rely on to be able to identify what's bogus and what's not. So in all these elements, we're in a race with technology, and to be able to harness it to improve the human condition, not create new, really overwhelming challenges.
Yes, another question?
This question is from Ian. Ian asks, the Senate Commerce is generally considered one of the most bipartisan committee on Capitol Hill. What do you consider is the number one factor or factors for the level of bipartisanship on the committee?
That's a really, really good question. I think it deals with issues that everybody really cares about, whether surface transportation, those types of things, scientific research, R&D, NASA, things that have a good bipartisan following. It's not like Health and Human Services or the Budget Committee or the Appropriations Committee. But I'll tell you, one of the most and it's a telling fact, one of the most bipartisan committees besides intelligence committees are the Armed Services Committee. And the reason that is that one, obviously national security has a bipartisan following for the most part, is that their markups are done in private. And I've talked to a lot of members who say one of the worst things to happen to the culture of Congress, inside Congress, has been televising proceedings and hearings, because they become a performance art rather than doing what these hearings and things are going to do. But yeah, I think it's just Commerce has a portfolio that lends itself to bipartisanship more than some of these other committees.
The next question that is coming in is from our former director at Eagleton, John Farmer. John says, thanks so much for your time tonight. You have served on several commissions, including the 9/11 Commission. That was viewed as a bipartisan success, and many thought it would be a model for dealing with difficult issues. Yet no commission has been formed to study the pandemic or other difficult issues. Do you agree that the commissions offer an avenue for bipartisanship? And what accounts for the failure to use 9/11 as a model?
Yeah, I do. And first of all, John Farmer is one of my favorite people and one of the most talented people I've worked with. And I've had the privilege to do that. And I'm a huge admirer. And yeah, I think the 9/11 Commission did show what could be done. And it had a little bit of a rocky start. But they realized the magnitude of the gravity of what was put before them. And they rose to the level, and the staff rose to that level. I don't understand why we wouldn't use that same model for the pandemic. I mean, in a way, it's kind of it's a sad commentary that independent commissions have to be stood up because people inherently think Congress is going to figure out a way to make it too political or too partisan. But it's a really a great tool, and it should be used more widely. In fact, whether it's the pandemic, or even when you're looking at our immigration problem, or you're looking at the debt and the deficit problem. And I will tell you, as young people, it's your future this is about. People like to dismiss this issue, and partly it's because Republicans have talked about debt and deficit was going to ruin our economy now for 40 years. And people say, when is that going to happen? But we are now spending more than we do in debt service than we do on defense, I believe. We've crossed that threshold. And for every penny that goes into paying the debt service is one penny less for all the things that other people care about, these programs and things that good governments are responsible for. But John, to answer your question, yeah, I don't know why it hasn't been used as a model. Maybe because in some instances, these issues, people are enjoying playing the politics with them. Immigration is great for the partisan wrestling match. Each side has their constituency and can demonize the other very easily. And that happens with the budget. It happens with immigration. And I think there's probably some folks that probably see there's some political mileage out of the COVID pandemic as well.
Next question we have is from Jessica. She asks, what's the best way for young adults to get started working in a congressional office? And what qualities are staff offices looking for in applicants?
Yeah, good question. So again, looking at the different elements of Congress, a really good way is to find somebody who you really believe in, who you connect with, and go to work on their campaign and work really hard and be as helpful as you can be, and let it be known that you would like to work in the congressional office. That's a really, really good way to do it. some of the most successful folks I've seen came as interns, showed what they could do, and then were hired as staff. So those are really good ways to get started at a younger age, and you get a really great education there as well. You contribute, obviously, but you learn a lot. I couldn't recommend it as a place to work more highly. You can make a real contribution. Again, it does depend on your member of Congress, because I know people who've been stuck with members they didn't terribly respect, and then it's not as much fun or as rewarding or as important to you. And in terms of skills, intellectual curiosity, the ability to write and to communicate, and the ability to listen is so crucial. And I say that from different just listening to constituents. You hear from constituents on every side of every issue, and you'll be on the phone with a lot of those constituents. And again, to be able to listen, to connect, to be able to communicate with them, your views, more importantly, the members' views, in a way that communicates accurately and politely, in many cases, is really critical.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions here. What's the best way for young adults to share issues that are important to them with their representatives? Is it calling the offices, protesting, going in person? Is one way better than another?
Yeah, I think going in person is the most effective. That's very difficult to do, but I will tell you again, not to over McCainize the thing, but he's my only frame of reference in terms of working directly for. There are a lot of groups that he would talk to that he didn't have anything in common with. Back in his day, there was the nuclear freeze group. They came to his door and he welcomed them in and sat down, talked to them. He gave his views, they gave theirs. And on the way out, the leader grabbed him and said, I think he was in the House at the time, said, "Congressman, we don't agree, but that's the first time someone's had the courtesy to sit down and listen to my point of view and treat me like an adult and share their views with me." So again, I think letters are always good. You can't promise, in my experience, that a member sees every letter. A lot of times they're batched. We're getting a lot of letters on this, but it counts. And a lot of members do say, "What's the mail saying?" on a particular vote where they don't really have a sense of how they want to vote. But yeah, nothing beats in-person visits.
Last question here is, how can we build bipartisanship in Congress?
A magic wand. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, wow. Well, I think some of these structural and institutional issues, addressing the gerrymandering issue, even things like, I wanted to say this before, it doesn't hit directly, but it's on the margins of it. When you look at some of the structures we have, like winner-take-all electoral votes, I think, again, is not conducive to centrism. No Republican ever needs to go to California to try to pitch for votes. No Democrat needs to go to Texas. I think if we, and there's people whose votes for president really never count, because we already know which parties are going to sweep that entire full vote of electoral votes. And I think if we had electoral vote reform where we did require members and presidents who set the tone for their parties, right? For Republicans to go to California to push for votes, big state, would have a moderating effect, which I think would be very helpful. I think for the institution itself to restore some of its traditions of socializing, of getting to know one another, would really help a lot. And then again, demanding this from the public. We have some really serious problems that we're not getting around with while the partisans play politics with these issues that are only growing worse and worse and worse. And until we demand and expect better of them, we're just going to get a lot more of the same.
Thank you, John. If I can transition on that particular comment, demanding a lot of our elected officials requires understanding the process. You've done a lot to illuminate that this evening. What do you think the role of universities is, or the responsibility of universities when it comes to civic literacy and civic engagement, not just on our campuses, but also in our communities?
Yeah, well, I think you said it, civic literacy. I think we take it for granted that people know how the system works and why it is the way it is and where the needs of a reform is. I think that's incredible. And I say, not to be cheeky about it, but when you've got a senator who's asked, what are the three branches of government, says the House, the Senate, and the president, I mean, that's really, really chilling. And you see a lot of that. So I don't think we can just presume that people come from secondary schools into the university or college setting, and we fool ourselves that we know when we don't, and we might presume that there's these skills. So I think a lot of that, and frankly, I'm working on that with institutions like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Businesses should be pushing it. We're doing it with the military. People that serve in the military need to understand how our system works, why it is the way it is. And that's not to say that CELIT is a perfect being and mechanism that can, on the contrary, you need to understand how it works so you can figure out how to make it better. That's why I have great faith, is that we have the mechanisms and systems in place to reform, to amend, to improve. We just need to get about that business. So, and I think protecting free speech. I'll tell you a little story. It might not be appreciated completely by the audience, but I want to tell it. We have some friends of quadruplets, great family, and they play Division I sports. And their coach and team decided that when they play the national anthem, that they're going to kneel and look away from the flag, and that we're all going to do that as a team. They didn't feel that way. They said, we don't think that's appropriate demonstration of our views. If it's one thing that unifies us, or two things, it's our anthem and our flag. And we don't know what good that does, and we don't want to do it. And they were beside themselves because they were getting cancel cultured. They had every right to express their speech as those who decided they wanted to kneel, and yet they were canceled out. So I think tolerance, I see a lot of intolerance from people who preach tolerance, the ability to tolerate free speech, but also I think what we don't tolerate is hatefulness of speech. And I think if we're a lot more polite, we open our ears and listen and think before we speak and be open to diverse views, we'll be a better college, university, Congress, and country.
Wow. Well, those seem like excellent words to close on. Before we thank John for his time tonight, I do just want to remind our audience that we have programs here at Eagleton throughout the year. This is the last program for this semester, so please follow the website and the newsletter to find out when the next great events are coming. There'll be many next semester. So with that, please join me in thanking John Raidt. John, thank you for your passion, your expertise, and your time this evening.
Great. Thanks for what you're doing. And I hope you all have great careers. We need you. Thank you for choosing this course of study. And thanks to the Institute of Politics. Really appreciate it.